The town meeting coordinating committee asked the planning department and planning department head to talk about zoning and to actually talk about the articles that are on the town meeting warrant coming up. So we'll have time for questions, and we'll have time to go over each of the articles. What, 5 articles? 6 articles coming to town meeting. So if you have questions, there'll be a chance for you to get answers and learn a lot. So Chris Brestrup, it's yours.
Good evening. Welcome to the Town Meeting Coordinating Committee meeting about zoning. I'm Chris Brestrup, Planning Director, and I have with me Rob Crowner. He is a member of the Planning Board and Chair of the Zoning Subcommittee, and Michael Burtwhistle, who's a member of the Planning Board. We expect that there might be one more Planning Board member showing up tonight. And I also have Steve McCarthy here, who is the Administrative Assistant in the Planning Department, and he made all the copies of the Planning Board reports for town meeting today. So thank you, Steve. David is here. David Levenstein, newest member of the Planning Board, is sitting in the back row. But since he wasn't part of coming up with these zoning amendments, he's not taking ownership of them. And he's just wants to learn. So anyway, many of you have heard my Zoning 101 lecture before, but I hope you won't be too bored if I give it again. So we're going to learn about zoning. So what is zoning? Many of you do know about what zoning is because you've been in town meeting and you've come to zoning subcommittee meetings and talked about it with the planning board, but for those who haven't, zoning is a way that the community can regulate the use of land. Zoning regulations allow a community to control where different uses occur and under what circumstances. So I'm going to show you the zoning bylaw. This is the last zoning bylaw that we actually published from May of last year. We have another zoning bylaw that is going to be published very soon, which will reflect what happened in November of last year. There's a lag because after town meeting passes articles, the Attorney General needs to approve them, and then it takes time for us to get together and actually make the changes. So Mr. McCarthy will be making those changes very soon. So in addition to zoning, the community also has subdivision regulations that govern how land is broken up. So this is our subdivision regulations that the Planning Board wrote a long time ago and continues to revise, and it and the zoning bylaw are both online. I meant to also point out that we have this, what we call the unofficial zoning map. Unofficial zoning map looks like this because it's really just sort of a generalization of what zoning is, but you can find this also on the town website. The official zoning map is the GIS map, Geographic Information Systems map, and it's very detailed and has information about all the zoning areas, and also you can find out anything you want to about any particular piece of property. So the GIS on our town website is really helpful. So the way land is broken up into parcels is regulated by the dimensional requirements of the zoning bylaw. And you will often hear us referring to Table 3 of Article 6. And Table 3 is, let's see if I can find it. I thought I had put a tab on it. Probably right there. Yep. So Table 3 looks like this. And it lists all the zoning districts across the top, and then lists down the side what a dimensional requirement is. So you have dimensional requirements for lot area, minimum lot frontage, setbacks from the street, setbacks from side lot lines, and each zoning district has its own set of dimensional requirements. The town's authority to create and implement zoning law comes from state law in the Zoning Act, Chapter 48 of the Mass General Laws. So you can look that up online. I have the paper copy here, It's very dense. It's not an easy read, but this is what we rely on to know whether our zoning bylaws are complying with state law. Zoning is also limited by state and federal law governing property rights, and zoning cannot violate the takings clause. You often hear things about takings when we're talking about zoning. We can't zone things in such a way that we take away all the value of the land for a landowner, unless we pay him compensation if the property is taken for public purposes. Sometimes takings are for building a roadway, but some people argue when their land is rezoned that the town has taken the value of their land by downzoning. Zoning must provide that at least some uses are allowed on each piece of land. So you'll see that if you look through the zoning bylaw in the use table, and I'll show you what that looks like. That's a much more dense table. It goes on and on for pages. It lists all the uses down the left-hand side of the page and the zoning districts on the top. And then in the columns down below, it talks about what kind of use, what kind of permit is allowed for each use. So all the uses are represented in this table, and if they're not represented there, then the building commissioner, who's the zoning enforcement officer, determines which use something is most like. So what's the history of zoning? Zoning ordinances, so I've been told, date back to 1791, when George Washington decreed that certain parts of Washington, D.C. could only use brick for buildings. So that was what people consider the first zoning in America. But the first official comprehensive zoning ordinance was adopted in New York City in 1916, and it was a response to overcrowding and lack of sunlight and unhealthy conditions where buildings were built smack up against each other with no windows and manufacturing going on in the lower floors and people living above, and it really wasn't a healthy situation. So they passed a zoning bylaw. And then in 1926, there was a Supreme Court case called Euclid versus Ambler Realty in Ohio, and the Supreme Court ruled that zoning did not violate the due process clause of the Constitution. And I've been to Euclid and I've seen why they probably wanted to do zoning there, because they had manufacturing next to houses, next to churches, and everything was all mixed together. Well, now we're going back to mixed use, but we're not allowing manufacturing as part of the mixed use. So anyway, Euclid is a good example. In 1940, by 1940, zoning was the most common means of regulating land use in America. Town of Amherst first adopted zoning in 1925. And the planning department has copies of zoning bylaws and maps going back to 1937. But I understand that the town clerk and the Jones Library have them going back farther than that. The town also has electronic copies of all the zoning bylaws, so if you're interested, you can read them all back to 1925. Why do we need zoning? Zoning allows the town to group land uses according to their compatibility. So generally speaking, we have residential uses together, we have commercial uses together, we have manufacturing uses together, and that's sort of the way the town is zoned. Zoning also allows the town to separate uses in ways that protect health, safety, and general well-being. Zoning enables the town to separate things such as industrial uses from residential uses, because we wouldn't want to live right next to an industrial use. The zoning bylaw is the whole body of regulations, both the zoning text and the zoning map taken together. And as I said, it's all available online. So how does zoning work? Zoning divides the town into districts, and there are many, many districts, and they're all listed in the front of the zoning bylaw. And there are residential districts and business districts and design review districts and professional research park districts, and they're all described here. So each one of them has a little paragraph describing what it's supposed to be about. Every piece of land is assigned to a district. So wherever you are in town, you're in some kind of zoning district. And the district boundaries don't necessarily follow property lines. Most of the time they do, but sometimes they cut right through property lines. And when there was a major zoning overhaul in the 1970s and decisions were made to create these sort of swaths of zoning along roadways, so you often find in particular like in farming districts where the first 200 feet might be RO zoning district, residential outlying, and then beyond that is RLD, which is residential low density. So that's a little bit of an anomaly, and sometimes it's hard to work with that when landowners are trying to develop property. The same zoning district may occur in more than one geographic location in town. In fact, most of the zoning districts do occur throughout town. The exception is the Office Park District, which is very limited in its location along University Drive. There are also overlay districts, which are mostly protective districts. There's a watershed protection district, which protects the area around Atkins Reservoir. There's the Aquifer Recharge Protection District, which protects the area around Lawrence Swamp, where we get a lot of our water. There's the Farmland Conservation District, which is an overlay district in some of the outlying farming areas that requires the use of a denser type of development in order to save farmland. So when you're developing property in those districts, you have to cluster your houses and leave open space. We have a municipal parking district, which has been the topic of conversation lately, which doesn't require on-site parking for certain uses in the downtown area. And we have other special districts, like Flood-Prone Conservancy District. And you're probably going to hear more about that in the future as we revise our flood maps. And then, last but not least, we have the Educational District, which covers a lot of the land that's owned by UMass and Amherst College and Hampshire College. It doesn't really have requirements with regard to use or dimensional requirements within the ED zoning district. And in fact, UMass is not subject to zoning at all because it's a state institution. So what else do I have to say? So what's the logic to some of the districts? So if you look at this map over here, this isn't exactly a zoning map, it's the land use policy map from the master plan, but it gives you a sense of where things are more dense. So you can see there are certain districts that are outlined. Here's the downtown area. This is the East Amherst Village, where the Jewish Community Center is. We have North Amherst Village Center in Cushman. And then in the south, we have Pomeroy Village and South Common, which is where the South Congregational Church is. And last but not least, we have the Atkins Corner Village Center. So those are areas that have been decided over the years to absorb most of the density in town, and the areas outside of those are expected not to be densely developed. So in addition to regulating uses, the zoning bylaw also contains regulations on signs, parking requirements, and inclusionary zoning for affordable housing. And it also talks about nonconformities. So you often hear about nonconformities when you come to a ZBA hearing because they deal with applications for special permits to alter nonconforming uses or buildings. Nonconformities are uses, buildings, or lots that existed prior to a change in the zoning bylaw. So if you have a property and you've got something built on it and the zoning changes, your property becomes legally nonconforming rather than illegal. And that puts it into a category where if you want to make any changes on your property, you generally have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals to get a special permit to make the changes, but you're still allowed to make them for the most part. So what does a planning board do? Under state law, planning board is responsible for master plans and strategic plans. And to give you an idea of what a strategic plan is, the planning board recently, in the last few years, hired a consultant to do a market study, a housing market study, and a housing production plan. And the planning board refers to those two plans. So those are some of the types of strategic plans that the planning board has put together. Planning board also creates and administers regulations, such as the subdivision law. Planning board writes the subdivision law with the help of staff and the town engineer. And it also drafts zoning amendments, which you're probably very familiar with if you're a town meeting member. Zoning amendments generally start with the zoning subcommittee, of which Rob Croner is the chair, and people come up with ideas about what needs to be done with the zoning bylaw. Either they've discovered a problem with it, or someone has come to the zoning subcommittee with an issue that they want to have resolved. And so that's kind of where a lot of zoning starts. It also can start with petitions. Mr. Kaner submitted a petition article recently to rezone part of North Amherst, so you'll hear more about that later, but that is certainly a valid way of starting a zoning amendment. The Zoning Board of Appeals and the Planning Board are slightly different. The Planning Board is generally the board that takes care of things that are considered to be, I'm going to say by right, and what we consider that to be is things that are normally accepted in the area in which they're proposed. So, a building downtown, a mixed-use building downtown with commercial on the ground floor and housing above is considered to be sort of an accepted type of use. So that goes to the Planning Board for site plan review. The Zoning Board of Appeals deals with things that are not absolutely expected, such as special permits for many things. And back in the 70s, when UMass expanded and Amherst experienced a lot of development, the decision was made to make many of the uses in town by special permit from the Zoning Board of Appeals. So you'll see, unlike many towns, Amherst has a lot more uses that require special permits from the Zoning Board of Appeals. The Zoning Board of Appeals also takes care of comprehensive permits, and we've recently had an experience with that in North Amherst with Beacon Communities proposing a development up in the vicinity of the Coles Lumberyard, where they're proposing a mixed-use development with 130 dwelling units and 26 of which are affordable, and they also have some commercial space there. So that's a comprehensive permit was granted to them because they were including 20% of the dwelling units as affordable units. That's a state law that allows that type of thing to happen. The ZBA also deals with variances, and every once in a while we get an application for a variance, and there are very strict laws that govern whether a variance can be approved or not. And it has to do with the shape of the land or some peculiarity about the property that makes it not able to follow the normal zoning bylaw. And in the last 15 years that I've been here, I could count on one hand the number of variances that have been granted. Maybe I could count on 3 fingers, I'm not sure, but it's a very low number. The other thing that the ZBA does is it hears appeals from decisions of the building commissioner. So the building commissioner makes a decision about, some setback or something, that some project isn't complying with the setback, and that can go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and then the Zoning Board of Appeals makes a decision by interpreting the bylaw and looking at state law in many cases. It makes a decision about whether to uphold the decision of the building commissioner or to overturn it. The ZBA has a certain set of criteria that it looks at when it's granting special permits, and we commonly refer to section 10.38 of the zoning bylaw. Many of you who have been on the ZBA or who have been in zoning board public hearings will be familiar with that, so you might want to take a look at that in the zoning bylaw. It lists all kinds of things that the ZBA expects out of the project, and they try to match, whether the project is actually adhering to those things or not. The ZBA holds public hearings and it notifies abutters within 300 feet of a property that a public hearing is being held. It reviews applicable laws and gets information from staff about those laws and considers the proposed development's impact on its surroundings. And then the ZBA, after it closes the public hearing, it holds deliberations among the board members at a public meeting and takes a vote on the application. And it can deny an application, or it can grant an application, grant a permit with conditions as to how the site will be developed and how the use will be conducted. The ZBA is pretty careful and strict about looking at things, and I think it does a really good job. If the ZBA denies an application, the applicant can't submit a similar application for a period of 2 years. So sometimes what you see is an applicant will get to kind of somewhere down the road in his public hearing process, and he'll realize that, oh, it looks like the ZBA isn't going to grant my special permit, so the applicant can withdraw. We call it withdraw without prejudice, which means that you can withdraw your application, but it doesn't put you in a position of having a judgment made against you. It just allows you to take back your application, maybe rethink something or change something, and then you can come back to the ZBA with a new application. The planning board uses a similar process in reviewing applications for site plan reviews, and the planning board also reviews some special permits. Some of them are specifically spelled out in the use table of the zoning bylaw, and some of them are part of dimensional modifications. And if you've heard of footnote A, you would be knowledgeable about that. I know Mrs. Greenbaum often talks to me about footnote A, so take a look at it. It allows modifications of certain dimensional modifications with a special permit from either the planning board or the zoning board of appeals. So the planning board and the ZBA are both appointed bodies. Currently they're appointed by two different entities. The planning board is appointed by the town manager, and the ZBA is appointed by the board of selectmen, or the select board, excuse me. In the new type of government that we're going to have after December of 2018, both the planning board and the ZBA will be appointed by the town council. Let's see here. What? Oh, excuse me.
What's the difference between a special permit and a variance?
That's a good question. A special permit is something that is specifically outlined in the zoning bylaw that says, yes, this type of use you can have by a special permit in a certain zoning district. Whereas a variance, we don't grant use variances in Amherst. Some towns do. In fact, I think Northampton might have use variances. We only have dimensional variances. So a variance is actually sort of stepping outside of the zoning bylaw and doing something that's not really allowed. But in certain instances, if your property has a big cliff on one side or has a big rock in the middle of it or something like that, then the zoning board of appeals would grant you a variance to build on the lot in a way that doesn't conform to the zoning bylaw. Let's see, what else? So comprehensive permits are a permit that's authorized under Chapter 40B of the Mass General Laws, and it was established for the purpose of creating affordable housing, because many cities and towns were adopting zoning that kept people out who had low income by creating large lots or various other types of zoning that, it was called exclusionary zoning, as a matter of fact. So back in the 60s, the state passed Chapter 40B, which states that if a town doesn't have at least 10% of its housing created or certified as affordable, then a developer can come in and propose a development that doesn't necessarily comply with the zoning bylaw, but does provide a certain amount of affordable housing. And usually it's 25% of affordable housing at 80% or less of area median income. But if you say that you're going to provide housing at a lower income level, such as Beacon did, Beacon is providing housing at 50% or less of area median income, they were allowed to only have 20% of their development be affordable. So currently, Amherst has more than 10% of its dwelling units certified by the state as affordable. And we're not really worried about falling below that, but we do have a very strong commitment to trying to provide affordable housing for people. And some of you are members of the Amherst Community Land Trust, and others are members of the Amherst Municipal Affordable Housing Trust. So those two groups are working very hard to create affordable housing in Amherst. And you'll hear about a zoning bylaw that is trying to promote more affordable housing. Let's see, I don't want to talk too long because I know you have questions about zoning things that are coming up. But recently, I just wanted to mention that we had two fairly substantial projects, aside from Beacon, that did provide quite a bit of affordable housing for Amherst. And one of them was the Olympia Oaks project in North Amherst along Olympia Drive, where there were 42 units of affordable housing created. And I think Mr. Perkins was very closely involved with that. So that was a really great project. And then we also had Rolling Green, which you may also be familiar with on Belchertown Road. That has about 200 units of housing, much of which is market rate, but it did have a component of affordable housing that was established whenever Rolling Green was built. And in the last several years, Beacon Communities bought that property and managed to refinance it in a way that it could preserve the affordability of the units that are affordable. So we're really happy about that. The town, let's see. So right now, the zoning bylaw is adopted and amended by 2/3 of the vote of town meeting. I believe that in the future it will be changed by 2/3 of the vote of the town council. The building commissioner is the zoning enforcement officer, which, as I mentioned to you before, he's really the final word in zoning, aside from the zoning board of appeals, who can overturn him. And staff members work very closely with the building commissioner and with the boards and committees to make sure that things are done in accordance with the law and in accordance with what we perceive are the, is the will of the people of the town of Amherst. The zoning bylaw is really a great document, and it mostly serves us well, but we are constantly discovering problems and conflicts and lack of clarity. In fact, something was just discovered today that was something that we didn't know about, that section of the bylaw that we've been looking at for, I'm going to say
14 years.
14 years. Yes, we've been reading it and rereading it for 14 years, and we didn't discover this. Anyway, maybe Rob Kreiner will tell you about it later. So the zoning subcommittee, the planning board works with staff and members of the public to address these issues in the zoning bylaw. We come up with new things, but a lot of the time is spent trying to fix things that we've discovered to be problems. Members of the planning board are here tonight to explain the zoning amendments that have been proposed for this upcoming town meeting, and they will give reports on the amendments. And then there will be an opportunity for you to make comments and ask questions. Okay? Oh, I should introduce you. This is Mr. Crowner, who will talk to you about, I think, 5 of the zoning amendments, and Mr. Burkensel will talk to you about at least 1. I'm not sure if they've made another arrangement with each other, but that's my understanding.
So we're going to go right into zoning amendments, or are we going to take questions on?
Oh,
general zoning?
sure. We could take questions on general zoning if there are questions. Sorry about that. Didn't think about that. Yes?
I have a question about the zoning articles that are coming before town meeting.
Do you state your name, please?
Yeah, Jerry Gadara. Why are we considering these at town meeting when we just passed a charter by 58% that pretty clearly says we're not supposed to do anything but keep the lights on?
Well, the charter doesn't exactly say that, and we have reached out to our town council, SEL, town lawyer, and he's recently come forth with a written document, which you'll all have access to, which gives us some guidance about which zoning bylaws can and can't be passed, and which warrant articles can and can't be passed. And it's mostly things like, if something is really new, that it hasn't been thought about or talked about or delved into by the planning board before, maybe those things are less likely to be considered for passage. Other things that the planning board has been working on for years and years are part of our normal business. So I think when you read this document, you will have some guidance. And I understand that he may be coming to town meeting to give a presentation in the beginning during that first special town meeting. And I should ask Mr. McCarthy, when someone wants to speak, if he would bring the microphone to you so that you can be heard by everybody. I'm sorry we don't have 2 microphones tonight, but...
I can speak louder if I need to. But so, when you go to present these articles, then, can you explain to us which one's town council, which by the way is just one attorney, thinks should be the purview of town meeting and which one should not be? Because what you're saying is that the town council has decided that certain articles we can consider at town meeting and certain articles we shouldn't, or we can't.
Is the microphone for people at home and for the...
Microphone is for people in the room.
I can do it all over again if you want.
That's all these know.
So, town council gives advice to the town, and the town hopefully will take his advice, but it's ultimately up to the select board to make the decisions about what can and can't be done. So at least according to town council, it is up to the select board. So we'll see over the next few weeks how this evolves, but I don't think we have definitive answers on anything. And Mr. McCarthy, will you pass the microphone to Ms. Adams?
I guess just a comment in response to the previous speaker. I believe there will be discussion at Select Board tomorrow night about some of those articles, number one. Number two, my understanding is there will be a transition committee established that may be weighing into this. And number three, it's always been my understanding, even with town meeting, that we reverse ourselves from one year to another. And so there would be no reason for the new council to not to reverse or to revise anything that we do as town meeting. And I suppose there's an argument that government shouldn't stop in its tracks while we wait for a new system to get started.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments about general zoning issues? Mr. Kaner, would you pass the microphone?
My name is Van Kaner. I just am curious about the ZBA's votes. I think they have to be unanimous. Is that true?
ZBA's votes have to be unanimous.
And planning board not. You're right. And how many members are in the ZBA? Is 3 a full complement? Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else?
So just a response to Mr. Kaner, there is one case in which the ZBA doesn't have to have a unanimous vote, and that is in the case of a comprehensive permit. So the vote can be 2 to 1 to approve a comprehensive permit. So I'm now going to hand the microphone over to Mr. Crowner, who will explain some of the zoning amendments that are coming before you.
Okay, we have 3 amendments dealing with recreational marijuana or marijuana uses. These are essential because if we don't put laws in place to regulate marijuana uses that we know are coming, we'll end up having to scramble, improvise, and we might end up with something that we don't exactly want. So these bylaws are clarifications or responses to the formal regulations that the Cannabis Control Commission has implemented since in just the last month in response to the legalization of recreational marijuana by the state a year and a half ago. So we brought, in the fall, we brought an article to establish regulations for recreational marijuana retailers, someone who sells marijuana over the counter, because we knew absolutely that was going to be coming to Amherst. But we didn't have, the state hadn't made any rules, so we were sort of flying blind. We basically inserted a recreational marijuana retailer use into the use chart and are regulating it in the same way that we have previously been regulating medical marijuana uses, which was approved a few years ago. Now that formal regulations have been promulgated by the Cannabis Control Commission, we are able to have better bylaw for all of the kinds of marijuana uses that the state is now going to allow. And in fact, they have defined a dozen kinds of marijuana uses, including research uses, lab uses, product manufacturing uses, cultivation uses, and other things, transportation of marijuana as a business. And so all of those things might want to locate in Amherst, we don't know, but if we want to be able to regulate them ourselves rather than have it sort of dictated to us or take a chance that we won't get what we want exactly, we need to put these bylaws in place. Or we need to revise our bylaw for this. So the primary, or the main marijuana article that we have, I think is 31. 31, 32? 31. And what this does is it establishes about a dozen new uses by putting definitions into the bylaw and putting those uses into the use chart. The definitions copy the definitions that the state has established in their regulations. And the uses that we chose are the ones that we thought were most like or most similar to the definition that the state has established. So, for instance, we are regulating, or we're proposing to regulate marijuana research facilities, marijuana testing laboratories in the similar ways that we already regulate testing facilities, research facilities in town. So, so the use chart will copy those lines in the use chart that are farther down in the use chart. So, and then for other kinds of uses like cultivation and manufacturing, we are more or less copying the same use chart that we have for medical marijuana, which is a special permit in mixed-use business zones. The independent testing and research ones will allow for site plan review in some zones, not in mixed-use zones in the office park and limited business where there isn't residential uses on University Drive. That article will also revise the standards and conditions for all marijuana uses to better reflect the fact that there are a wide range of marijuana uses now and not just a few. It generalizes references to marijuana uses instead of specifying medical or recreational, and it includes references to the Cannabis Control Commission and the appropriate state regulations in the bylaw so that we match where we should match. The other thing that this article will do will change the buffer zone around the K through 12 schools. The current bylaw, the current regulations, a 300-foot buffer measured from building to building, essentially, between marijuana uses and certain kinds of protected uses, schools, residential uses, libraries, churches, those kinds of things. That buffer will stay in place for all those uses, libraries and so on, except for the school uses, which will be a 500-foot buffer measured from property line to property line, so it's actually pretty strict. That buffer is copied also from the state regulations. The state or recommendation is a 500-foot buffer around schools, and so we are copying that, and we are clarifying how our 300-foot buffer is measured. That will have the effect of making it very difficult to locate a marijuana use in the town center, and making it a little more difficult to have marijuana uses in other parts of town, like the East Village and Pomeroy Village, where there are schools in the K through 12 range. So I think those are the high points of Article 31. Article 30 changes the definition, changes a small part of the definition for medical marijuana uses. Medical marijuana uses, when the law was first passed, were restricted to nonprofit operators. And so we had a reference to nonprofit operators in the definitions for medical marijuana uses. That's no longer going to be the case. a medical marijuana operator is going to be allowed to also have a recreational business, and they will not be restricted to nonprofit uses. So Article 30 will just delete references to nonprofit in the two medical marijuana uses. And Article 32 clarifies the limitation that we put on recreational marijuana retailers in the fall to 8. We wanted to restrict it to eight locations, but we use the term 8 establishments. Establishments is now the broad term for marijuana uses. A marijuana establishment may be one of a dozen uses. So we want to clarify that we actually mean no more than 8 retail sales locations in town. And so that Article 32 was changed establishment to uses, or to locations. That part of the bylaw, or that article, is actually incorporated into Article 31. So if Article 31 passes, we will not have to do Article 32.
Just a problem with one microphone.
Janet McGowan. Rob, can you tell me if Article 31 does not pass, does that mean all those uses, those 12 uses, would be allowed in Amherst or excluded from Amherst?
I believe what would happen is if someone proposed one of those uses, the building commissioner would attempt to match it to an existing use in the bylaw. That match might not, or what he chooses might not be exactly what we want. I believe that most of those uses would be allowed. I guess actually I should note that Article 31 actually introduces a couple of uses, or 3 uses, that the state has not defined yet. Social consumption operators, social marijuana clubs, and marijuana delivery services. We are specifically putting those in the bylaw so that we can establish those as not allowed in Amherst anywhere. Until we get.
Can you repeat that?
Sure.
What's not allowed?
So 3 of the uses that we're putting in Article 31 are social consumption club, social
Cafe.
Yeah, cafe, basically, or a delivery service, a takeout or a to-go place.
Is a yes or a no?
So we're putting those in the bylaw, defining them, and putting them in the use chart as no's all the way across the board,
Oh, it's no.
as no's.
Oh, okay.
So those, if you propose that, you can't do that.
Oh.
If we did not put those in there, someone could propose a club like they have proposed in other cities, and we would have to figure out how to fit it into our bylaw without having a specific use for that. And we might not like what happens. We might be forced to allow it. Yeah, and I'll just a second. And so for other kinds of uses like marijuana product manufacturer or independent testing lab, we already have analogous or similar kinds of uses in our bylaw. I suspect that if someone proposed one of those kinds of uses, instead of being put into the marijuana packager or the marijuana testing lab, they would just be put into the generic lab. And so those would be allowed in the same way that we're allowing them, but they wouldn't have the standards and conditions that adhere to marijuana uses, so they wouldn't have a buffer zone and those kinds of things.
So just as a follow-up question, so in order to make sure, if we wanted to make sure,
I'm sorry. If those people didn't want to have those 12 uses, they would have to be excluded in the bylaw? Do you know what I'm saying?
If you don't want those uses, you have to put them in the bylaw and make them no's
okay.
in the use chart.
I have 3 questions, and you did answer my 4th one. The first has to do, is the Board of Health also coming out with a set of regulations? And the reason I ask this is because of an article I just read in the Globe this morning about the problems of smoking marijuana in the city of Boston in condominium buildings or large apartment buildings, where there is a cigarette smoking ban, but people with allergies, etc., are very sensitive to the, I don't know what marijuana smells like, but apparently it's pretty powerful. Even growing the plants is pretty powerful in a residential building. So I'm wondering, that's more of a Board of Health issue, I guess, than a zoning issue. So are they, my first question is, are they having a parallel set of regs to go along with this?
I have an answer to that. Mr. George is here from the Board of Health, and he may be able to answer your question. So would you pass the mic to Mr. George over there?
Yeah, Steve George, Precinct 4, Board of Health. Yeah, the Board of Health is actively discussing regulations. There's a lot of issues involved in terms of inspections and things like that, and in provision of educational materials by the adult use retailers. So we're considering all of that. The tobacco ban in Amherst is quite strong, and it refers to more than just tobacco, cigarettes. So possibly that's already taken care of. But yes, the Board of Health is very interested in this whole issue.
My second question is, I haven't had a chance to read all this material since it just came out, but could you tell us what differences there may be between the medical and the recreational uses in the bylaw? Or are they essentially the same? Any regulations, use, location, whatever?
Differences between medical uses and retail sales uses, or other kinds of
What would impact the public? Are you I sort of bits and pieces that I've heard at meetings on the television, that you're essentially going to take the medical use bylaw that we passed and apply it to the recreational. So I'm asking, I guess specifically in terms of the locations of medical establishments, office, wherever they're giving out medical marijuana, is it gonna be different, or are they pretty much the same locations? And how is the number of medical related to the number 8?
There is no limit on the number of medical marijuana facilities. In terms of how they're operated.
Regulated.
Excuse me.
So the state will be regulating medical uses, and they will be regulating retail uses, all kinds of retail uses. They're going to have their own regulations, and any operator will have to follow the state regulations as well as ours. What will be different is where in town they're allowing them and what kind of permitting we're requiring for each of those. So right now, medical uses will require a special permit in the mixed-use zones. Recreational retail sales will require a special permit in the mixed-use zones. A marijuana cultivator or a craft marijuana cultivator will require a special permit in the business mixed-use zones. Independent testing laboratory and product manufacturer and research facility will require a special permit in the mixed-use zones.
Excuse me, that's not really what I was asking.
Okay.
It's places that are open to the public, whether they're medical or recreational, location.
Have to talk. The ZBA is going to be reviewing all of these things. So they review the medical one and they review the retail one. The retail one is obviously going to have more traffic than the medical one. In fact, some of the retail ones to date, one of them, they've put a limit of every 10 minutes or something, an appointment. So in other words, you can't have a flood of people coming into the building because the property is very small and it's in an awkward location where if there were a lot of traffic, it would really cause problems. So the ZBA considers these things very carefully, and when they are considering a retail location, they're going to want to know how many people do you expect per minute, per hour, per 15 minutes, whatever, and is your parking going to accommodate it, and is your access going to accommodate it? Do you have enough waiting area? All of those things. So the ZBA looks at all of these things really carefully. Does that answer your question?
So if the retail establishment is gonna be more by appointment like the medical, it's not gonna be walk-in like a store?
It depends on where it's located. If it's located in a place where it's reasonable to have a big parking lot and access is easy and the space is big enough, I don't think that the ZBA will put limitations on how frequently somebody, how often the appointments are, or if there are appointments. They've only put appointments on one location to date, and that's the old hangar location on University Drive, because they have a small parking lot. They have an access road right in front of them that makes driving awkward there. But the other location up in North Amherst, GTI on Meadow Street, they didn't put any limitation on number of people per hour or appointments. So I think each case is going to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, like the ZBA always does.
So it's not like Cumberland Farms?
No.
I have my third question. I'm sorry about, given there are so many zoning articles and the question that was asked earlier, if the town council does not like the action taken by town meeting on any of these articles, what is the state law, if there is one, with regard to their overturning the action of town meeting? In other words, if we have a 2-year limit now, I think that's what it is, before a bylaw can be brought back unless it's substantially amended, what would the council be allowed to do if they're not happy with something that we do at town meeting with regard to zoning?
Transition committee.
The town council will be able to change zoning if they want.
But they don't have to wait 2 years?
So you don't have to wait 2 years if the planning board recommends the article. The planning board can bring any article back.
So it's the
anytime.
same, okay.
Mr. Lee, maybe?
Thanks. Jeff Lee, Precinct 7. Just curious, will private preschools and daycare centers be protected by the 500-foot buffer?
So right now, no, they would have the 300-foot buffer. The state regulations did not make any reference to preschools or daycare centers. So when we were writing ours, we decided not to get too fancy. We decided to just copy what they had. We already have the buffer in place for those. It's not as strong, but it's still a decent buffer, and it can be changed in the future.
Also, I think that the thought was that preschoolers would be unlikely to be out on their own. They would always be with a supervisor or a teacher or something like that, and so they wouldn't be likely to go into a place like this if they were with their preschool group. So it's really the grade schoolers through high school that would be more vulnerable.
Maureen Adams, I have 3 questions. Why don't I just ask them and then you can take your pick. The first one is is it your expectation that there's only one current medical facility now in Northampton and there's none here, correct? Is it the expectation that medical and recreational, shall we say, will coexist but with different entrances and different regulations? So that's my first question. My second question is I'd love to know something about federal and state law. That is, whether medical marijuana is permitted by federal law or only by state law, and so that with both medical and recreational we have this difficulty of federal law and state law. And my third question has to do with Article 31. It's very helpful to see, 1235 down to 1243 or whatever it is, with all these different aspects of the cannabis business, which I would think would refer to medical cannabis as well, even though that's in a separate article. So I'm wondering that if something were to happen to 31, would they somehow still be in place with regard to medical marijuana facilities? That's a kind of if-then hypothetical, but I'm just interested.
So the state law has some regulations about separation of retail marijuana and medical marijuana. I think that answers your first question. Second question, I forget.
Was the law?
Federal law says no marijuana. No, they're not, they do not recognize medical marijuana or retail marijuana. There's been some question about whether they would actually take action. And I know the Attorney General has said they would, but there seems to be a kind of backing away from that, so I'm not exactly sure what the status is. I think Colorado is probably the one that's most out front, but I understand there's been some agreement between the federal government and Colorado that federal won't take action, but that's just something I heard on the news. And Mr. Crandall will answer the third question.
So, I'm not sure exactly what you're asking about. That if Article 31 doesn't pass, then we won't have these definitions in there. Medical marijuana definitions are already in there. The retail sales is already in there.
I see.
So, yeah.
Steve George, Precinct 4. One other question about the exclusionary zones. In the original language that was passed in November, daycare centers are explicitly mentioned, but that's omitted in this case. In the proposal, I wonder, is there a reason for that? Because I think on the Board of Health, there's a lot of concern about why preschoolers were any different from kindergartners in all of this. And then to take out the explicit reference to daycare centers suggests that maybe you weren't serious about that.
So the planning board felt that daycare centers fell under the category of where children commonly congregate in an organized, ongoing, formal basis.
That's why I was asking.
This is a new experiment or situation in Massachusetts, but it's not new in other states. And I asked this question last fall, and I wonder if you could provide some information to town meeting members by articles, links to information in the packet from what is the experience of other states and towns and cities? Like, you know, what is the perspective of boards of health, schools, police? You know, what were the impacts on neighborhoods? You know, the pros, the cons. I feel like, I mean, I could read this and I can understand it. I just don't know what I'm really voting on, and what are the good sides, what are the bad things, what are the pitfalls. I feel like I have no other information other than a couple of visits, you know, to, you know, kind of a sleazy area of medical marijuana in California, seeing an article where there's a grow facility that looked like a medium security prison. It didn't look so appealing to me to have in our community. I mean, I feel like I have almost no factual background or any information about the experiences of other states. And I just I can go on my own search, but I think it'd be more helpful to 240 town meeting members to have some more information from the planning board, the Board of Health, you know, what the concerns of the schools are, you know, what are the experiences of other school districts and places like that. So I just urge you to provide that.
Okay. I don't have an answer for that, but it's a good one. So I'm going to go on to the next set of articles. Unless you want to first.
Yeah. Forgive me for keeping my seat here because I have a little leg problem at the moment. This is about the supplemental dwelling units bylaw, article number 33. currently, in the zoning law, I'm sorry?
Oh.
I need to be, okay, thank you. Currently, 5.0111 of the zoning bylaw about supplemental detached dwelling units allows such a unit, which is basically a separate structure on the property of a larger dwelling unit, a house, to exist, providing it is at least 350 square feet, and no more than 800 square feet. This is generally thought of as a mother-in-law unit or a supplemental unit in the back, largely put in the bylaw so that people could stay in their homes and possibly downsize or possibly use an additional unit for children, aging parents, or move it into it themselves as their children move away from the main house. Integral to the bylaw is the idea that one of the two units be owner occupied. That is to say, whoever owns the property must live in one of the two units, either one. That permits the other unit to be rented or occupied by another family member. Currently, the bylaw says that this supplementary detached dwelling unit can be occupied by no more than 3 adults. This amendment to the bylaw suggests raising the occupancy space from 800 square feet to 1,000 square feet. The reason we're doing that is because since the bylaw has been enforced, the planning department has had occasion to rule that a proposed use is too large. A proposed building is not within the bylaw. People would like to build these kinds of units, but they'd like to build them a little bigger than 800 square feet. That's pretty small if you're trying to downsize a family that's lived in a 2,000 square foot house for their lives, and they want to downsize, but they don't want to go down quite that far. This arose from a study that the planning board took up about a year ago of the 2015 housing market study, which suggests the need for the development of all kinds of housing in Amherst, both low income and affordable, and student and residential apartments, as well as individual houses. This is a modest proposal, I think, not designed to solve all the problems, but designed to provide some additional modest housing in all areas of town, not necessarily just the downtown, and not necessarily in the residential outlying districts, but throughout town, wherever individuals want to add additional property, housing to their own property. The frequently heard argument that this is simply a way to build more housing for students is not quite true, I think. To be sure, it's not impossible that someone who owns currently a 2,500 square foot house and has room on his or her property to build a small 1,000 square foot house, move into it, and rent the larger house out to students. Yes, that can happen. However, the whole notion that you're still living in the back of the property or the other part of the property is a significant break on the behavior of student population. So if you own a house and you want to move into a smaller house and rent your house out to students, you're going to want to make sure your house is taken care of. So you individually, the property owner, has the responsibility and the authority to make sure that the house you rent to students is occupied in a way that's satisfactory to your own way of life. And I think that, while not perfect, is a reasonable approach to providing some additional housing structure in the town. This is fairly straightforward. This process exists right now. What we're really doing is allowing a slightly larger footprint and slightly larger square footage for an existing ordinance. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
What about parking?
Just a minute.
What about parking? How is parking, are there requirements for added parking if there's gonna be a structure like that on the property? No.
I will be corrected if I'm wrong, but the supplemental unit exists as an accessory to the primary use, which is a single-family home that requires, so much parking. The accessory use is part of the main use. It's not a separate use. It's accessory to the main use, and so there won't be additional parking requirements. It does not change the requirements of the dimensional table. The only thing that might limit it is the size of the lot, and so the lot coverage, the total lot coverage. But it does not require additional area on the lot to put it in a new unit. And it doesn't require, I don't believe that it will require additional parking, but we'll find out for sure.
So in that scenario that you mentioned of creating a 1,000 square foot house that me and my husband would move into, and then we would rent our big house, let's say, to students, that's gonna, if that happens, it's gonna mean there's a lot more cars going through the neighborhood, and where are they gonna all park? And realistically, I remember when this in-law apartment thing was first brought to town meeting, and and it was voted yes, but the consequence of that was not what the intention was. So I'm curious about how this could sort of devolve the same way.
I'm not sure quite what the consequences you're referring to are. Have there been a lot of apartments built in your backyard that are unpleasant to you? As far as the parking is concerned, if it's your property, you have the opportunity to create parking spaces or not create parking spaces, and make whatever parking space or not parking space you want contingent on how you want to rent your property.
Alex Day, Precinct 10. I just have a question. Is this only related to building a new structure, or is it also, like many of the old houses downtown have carriage houses and barns, and does this also apply to existing structures?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it applies to a new structure and to a remodeled existing structure as well. Continue. Follow up.
So what if the existing, I'm speaking actually from personal experience, because we did this, and we were, by the way, required to add parking.
Excuse me?
We redid our carriage house, and we were required to add parking, much to my chagrin.
By whom?
Huh?
By whom?
By the zoning board.
Of appeals?
Yeah, we had to get a special permit. Anyway, I digress, but we did have to add parking, and it was an in-law permit. But my question actually is, so our existing structure was actually larger than 800 square feet. So I guess that's my question, and our space is done. So just more, if somebody has a barn downtown or a carriage house, and the existing space is larger than 800 or now 1,000, I assume they have to go in front of ZBA. I guess I just want to understand, it's easy to build a new structure, but I think many of the older houses where people find themselves in this situation have existing structures that may or may not be within the square footage that you're looking at. And so I guess I just am curious, if we're fixing the bylaw, like, is that something we should be looking at, is where there are existing structures already?
So I'm not aware of the particulars of your case, Ms. Lefebvre, but you may have applied for a converted dwelling. And converted dwellings are buildings that could be outbuildings or they could be the main building. But a converted dwelling can be bigger than 800 square feet. And it can be a barn or a garage or something that is created into a dwelling unit. And I don't believe there's any square footage limitation on, other than a low limitation. I think it can't be less than 350 square feet. But I don't think there's an upper limitation on a converted dwelling. So I would have to look at your particular issue. Right.
And also, a detached supplemental unit would require a special permit and would go to the ZBA. So the ZBA might impose parking requirements that the bylaw doesn't explicitly state.
This really should be for new buildings. This bylaw really is more about new construction.
No, I don't think necessarily. It could be about a garage or something if you want to make it a garage. There's something.
Dorothy Pam, District 10. There is no requirement in preserving any green space. In a community that I lived in before, people were very interested in paving over their front yards, parking trucks, and packing as many people as possible in until it turned into a planned community preservation district. I see a lot of problems down the road with this plan that you have in terms of losing green space and lawns.
The dimensional requirements, which you can find on Table 3, determine how much green space must remain, and it's fairly significant. The basic maximum building coverage in the residential districts remain between the 20 and 25% building lot coverage.
You have worked in something.
Oh, it's really addressed in the dimensional regulation table.
Can this 1,000 square feet be like 500, like can be 2 stories? Is that, can you count it that way too? Okay.
I see two big loopholes here that can create a problem, and I'm thinking from the point of view of having enforced a converted dwelling level. One is you need to define habitable space. That's a very ambiguous term when you go to apply it, which means if you're looking at bedrooms that are 13.5 by 10 or 13.5 or whatever, if you're going from wall to wall on the interior versus going from the outside footprint, which the assessor would use, you can end up with a building that's as big as a cape. So habitable space to me, depends what you count, what you call habitable. You can end up with a pretty big building there, even on a small footprint if it's 36 feet high, for example. The other thing that you've totally forgotten, this is a college town. Parents buy houses that their kids live in. We have several of these pigsties on Pleasant Street, which I've gone by for at least 30 years, and they don't improve with time. They are owner occupied. They could build something like this in the backyard and pile 4 more students in there, because you can have a one-room apartment and still, by the laws of the town, 4 people can live in it. And that's 8 cars plus their buddies. When you give the permit to the mother and father who come in, you're not asking them who lives there. And these kids can say, well, they're adults, they're 18. Who knows what an adult is? So I think that you need to think about that, because I've been thinking about it. Every time I drive down North Pleasant Street, those are owner-occupied houses, and they're disgusting, and you don't go that way. So that was the other thing. And then, in terms of 1,000 square feet, which is a pretty big house, I don't know, every now and again I watched a tiny house program on, was it House and Garden TV or one of them? And they have 4 people, dogs and cats living in a trailer, and they're very happy. At least they are on television. I don't know how many divorces there are the next week, but at least when they show the 4 people live, and the husband and the wife are up in some loft on the top of the trailer. But I mean, you have to think real carefully what these dimensions mean and what is habitable space. And maybe it would be better to stick to a footprint rather than worry about, does this closet count, but that doesn't count, and the cellar or the attic where somebody could convert it. Who knows? But I see those as issues.
As far as habitable space, the bylaw 1221 defines habitable space pretty precisely. And I think it answers most of the questions that you have. As far as the notion of an owner-occupant, a parent buying a house and having an adult child living in it for the 4 years and renting the rest of the space to his or her friends or other students without friendships, conceivably that's possible. Does that happen a lot? I don't know. Is there any way of knowing that?
I'm
that's
just
happening?
raising it as an issue.
Yeah, I understand that it's a possibility. Whether it's an actual reason for worry or not, I don't know. I would think it would be the rare parent who wants to spend 6 figures to buy a house and rent the rest of it out for 4 years and then try to have the hassle of reselling it. Maybe some people want to do that.
A lot of people want to do that all over Boston and all over.
Well, this isn't Boston, number one.
It's happening here too.
Okay. I don't know, and I'd like to know if it is happening. I'd like some
show you.
statistics about it.
I'll show you.
Maureen Adams, a comment and a few questions, maybe 2 or 3. The comment is, we do have an example on Lincoln Avenue of an owner who was egregious in stuffing students into a large Lincoln Avenue house. And when we finally demonstrated that he didn't really live there, even though he had his name over a little door, he turned it into an LLC. His daughter now lives there, and his son now lives another place. So he has a number of rental properties that are really student properties where his children, as part of an LLC, cover as owners. This is just one example. We're aware of other examples that we're tracking. So much as in my heart, I absolutely heartily agree with this proposal, I do have to look at the devils in the details. So let me ask a few questions, since the devils are always there ready to spring up at us. One is, I assume that owner occupancy continues with the property, that when it's sold, okay. Now, I'm also aware that the Zoning Board of Appeals will release a property from owner occupancy. They'll have hearings about turning it into a rental, what the management plan would be, etc. So I assume there's no reason to think otherwise than that a main house and a 2-story accessory unit that could presumably house more than 3 occupants. It couldn't, okay, so only 3 legally. And the house could possibly be large enough to turn into a duplex. And yes, is there anything preventing that? You could presumably have 4, 8. So you cannot, and the ZBA is restricted from coming up with a management plan? And where is that in the article, or where is that in the legality?
So there may be cases where the ZBA is has decided to release the owner occupancy requirement condition where that's allowed, where it's not necessarily required that the use requires owner occupancy, like for certain kinds of duplexes. Duplexes can be owner occupied or not owner occupied. This specifically says that one of the units has to be owner occupied, and there's no way to change that. Additionally, the supplemental dwelling unit is accessory to a single-family home. It's not accessory to a duplex.
Eve Vogel, two different questions. One is, why is there a minimum? Speaking of the tiny houses. And the second is, it seems like so many of the concerns relate to cars. And I'm wondering if any of our zoning ordinances restrict the number of cars that are allowed on a property.
The minimum, the article is about changing the maximum. It's not about changing the minimum. The minimum already exists. If you think the minimum should be changed, that's a separate issue. As far as the number of cars are concerned, every rental arrangement has a parking plan and is required to present how many cars will be parked on the lot to the building inspector, and that's
But
part
this
of it.
wouldn't be considered a rental property, right? This would be considered a residential.
If it was rented?
If it's rented, it's a rental property. Yeah.
So are that, I mean, yeah, I see rental houses with, cars all over the front lawn, so is Amherst trying to regulate that at all? Yeah.
It is regulated, but is it enforced? That is the other question.
Unless there's a really pressing question, I want to move on because we got half an hour, right? Unless people want to stay later, we have a big article to talk about. So I'm going to move on. And we're going to talk about inclusionary zoning now. Articles 34, or 35 and 36. This is our latest attempt to fix inclusionary zoning so that it actually works the way, more or less the way people want it to work, but also does not have any unintended consequences of perhaps depressing development, which has been a concern of the planning board. So we've had a long running controversy about how we should interpret the mandate for a special permit to trigger the inclusionary zoning bylaw. Inclusionary zoning is a requirement for a development to include housing that is affordable. And right now the bylaw requires, or at least the way the planning board has interpreted it is, if the use itself requires a special permit to exist, then the inclusionary zoning bylaw is triggered. However, there are many uses, particularly in the town center, that require a special permit for use that can exist with a site plan review, not with a special permit, but might also require or also request a special permit to vary a dimension or for some other reason. So a special permit that is ancillary to the use itself. And should that require inclusionary zoning? And because the planning board has not interpreted that, none of the new developments downtown have included affordable housing as part of the development. So we think we've now found a way to fix that in a way that is satisfactory to the planning board and hopefully satisfactory to other people. And the way we're going to do that is have certain kinds of dimensional special permits trigger the inclusionary zoning bylaw. Dimensional permits that affect the total size of the development. So dimensional a special permit to modify the building coverage or the lot coverage or the height or the number of floors. Any of those speak to a larger building. And so a larger building, it seems to us, is appropriate to trigger inclusionary zoning. So that is a proposal for those kinds of special permit modifications only, and not for other kinds of special permit dimensional modifications, such as setbacks, which don't necessarily lead to a bigger building, or for signage or other things. So that's part one of the article. Part two of the article, our article, is a provision to increase the flexibility for a developer to meet the inclusionary mandate. Right now, the mandate requires actual provision of units within the development itself. The new provision would allow some of that mandate to be met by payment of a fee in lieu of providing the actual units, or providing those units off-site. For developments that are less than that result in less than 4 affordable units, all of those units could be provided either off-site or by a fee. For developments that have 4 or more affordable units as part of their inclusionary requirement, at least half would have to be provided on-site, and the other half could be provided by the other methods. The fee that is being proposed is 3 times the median family income for the area, which currently is about $67,000. So the fee for any affordable unit would be $200,000 more or less. And that fee for each unit, and that fee would go to the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust, which they would use to provide affordable housing somewhere else. The off-site units would have to be provided within the same zoning district as the main development, or within 500 feet of the main unit if it's in another zoning district. So around the edges of the district where the main unit is. The article would also clean up some language that we've noticed in past attempts to fix the inclusionary zoning bylaw. So I will go over those if people are interested. But the main part is expanding the trigger and providing some flexibility. The planning board article incorporates wholly the petition article, which is Article 36, and it just adds the flexibility part of it. So our article is the same as, with a little bit more. Our understanding is, and our hope is that the petitioner is going to support our article. We have been informed that he will. And so we consider this a joint article, and we're looking forward to actually making this succeed. So I'm going to take questions now.
Barbara Ford, what was the rationale for not including the setbacks? And because it seems to me you can still build a larger building if you work right to the setback.
Setbacks might be involved in a larger building, but not necessarily. You could just take the same building and just move it, into the corner over the setbacks, but not make it any bigger. And so the setbacks are particularly tricky downtown because of the small lots, and some of the lots have weird angles. And also the way we are interpreting, or the way the bylaw has been changed so that setbacks, how setbacks are calculated, it makes it difficult to not need a special permit in many cases. And so we don't think that a normal building, a regular building, that anyone would like or approve, necessarily should have to have that, the extra mandate of providing affordable housing, which is a cost. We just don't think that setbacks are necessarily leading to a larger building and thereby justifying the additional cost of the mandate.
I'm lost. They don't necessarily lead to a larger building, agreed. Sometimes they do. Why should those not have the same requirements of other buildings that get to be bigger? I'm not parsing that.
If they're going to be bigger, it's because they're going to be taller or have a bigger footprint, and both of those are covered. Okay,
Pleasant Street is a very good example where the bylaw says if it abuts a general residence zone, which the cemetery is, the bylaw says shall have 20-foot setback. Now that building, if it had 20-foot setbacks on both side yards and rear yard, would be a lot smaller than it is now. The other place the bylaw says is that it should be 0 or 10. And a building with a 10-foot setback, side and rear yards or even front yard, is gonna be a lot smaller than the one that you have going up now.
So, One East Pleasant is the building that's being referenced. It's actually, it does not exceed the maximum building coverage. It doesn't. Yes,
It doesn't follow the bylaw either. I'm not going there now.
Okay.
We've been there, but I'm just saying that that building would be a lot smaller if it was built according to the bylaw.
Within the setbacks.
With the setback,
Yeah.
20-foot setback on 3 sides is a lot.
It's a lot of feet.
Yes.
Dorothy Pam, District 10. I am not sure, I don't really know what the rules are. Just from looking at what happened, I assumed that their buildings were supposed to be further back and somebody got permission to build the building up to the street. But perhaps there was no rule in the bylaws or the laws. Do you have, are there any rules on the book that says a building should be so many feet? I mean, in New York City they have these rules, that a building should be so many feet from the sidewalk? Or you do have those rules? Then did somebody get special permission not to follow them? Because it looks to me that like the building is crowding the sidewalk, and I just, to me, I was just startled. I thought, is this what the rules are for building in the town? Because if they are, I think they should be changed.
So the setback requirements in the general business district downtown are a minimum of 0. You can build right up to the line, or a maximum of 20. That's the law that's on the books. So the One East Pleasant and Kennedy Place did not receive permission to vary the front setback at all.
With all due respect, I think we're missing the point here. The point is to provide more access to affordable housing. Yes, perhaps setbacks should have been included. However, this is a significant improvement over the current situation. It is a compromise in many directions, and I think we would be well advised to not obsess about setbacks or any of the particulars of the bylaw, but to think about the idea of what it can achieve soon and what it will prevent happening in the future, which is to say more buildings like One East Pleasant Street without any affordable housing.
Maria Adams. I'm one of the et als on Jerry Weiss's citizen petition, and we really do support what the planning board. So I just want to say that in affirmation of what you've said. Now, I have two clarifying questions. One is, my understanding is that most of us didn't understand that Kendrick Place and Winnie's Pleasant were built on properties that allowed things that we disagree with by right, which is different from other zoning requirements. So that is my understanding of a clarification there about why we need not expect that this is going to happen with other developments that have inclusionary use. My second clarifying, I guess it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, our disagreements in the past had been about special permits, not for use, but for dimensions. And my understanding is you've now clarified the dimensional issue in relation to building units. Is that correct? Dwelling units. So it's not an issue of size or setback or anything else where inclusionary zoning kicks in from special permits on dimension, but it's how many more dwelling units. No, I'm wrong, okay.
It's completely about the size of the building. So if the building is proposed to be larger than the dimensional table otherwise would allow, whether or not that allows additional units, then inclusionary zoning would be required. So you might, Kendrick Place, for instance, got special permits for building coverage and lot coverage, and they increased by 5%. The developer could, if this had been in place, the developer could have chosen to make those buildings a tiny little bit smaller and not lost any units conceivably. They would just have to make smaller units. But if they decided to actually get the special permits, make it a little bit bigger, make it fit, because they want units of a certain size or whatever, even though they didn't add any units, the inclusionary zoning would still reach rate.
Alex Faye, forgive me because I'm not nearly as up on zoning as everybody else in this room, I suspect, but the payment of fees in lieu of affordable units, I guess I just wanted to better understand that. In theory, it sounds like a good thing, but I guess I want to understand in practice. I mean, it always seems cheaper for a developer to pay some money than to actually have the affordable housing built. So I guess I just wanted to understand from a practical perspective, like are we really going to wind up with the affordable housing that we want in the end when that's an option? And will that allow for rental units as well as sale? I just want to wrap my arms around that piece of it a little bit better, if that's possible.
So our intent with the fee in lieu, the payment in lieu, is that it is attainable, but not the easy way out. So ideally it's set a little bit higher than the actual cost of providing the affordable unit. But it may still be preferable to pay that extra cost, particularly in a smaller development, because an affordable unit will have a bigger impact on a smaller development. And the developer may not have experience in providing affordable units, may not want to go through the expense of partnering with another agency to manage it for them. So that's it's offered as an option. When we have previously talked about other ways of complying with the affordable mandate, we have thought about offering a fee in lieu, but we didn't really have a place to put it. It's something that would just go somewhere and sit in an account, and who knows if it will be used. We think that the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust is going to be an active player in town. They're gonna get the money, they're gonna be able to use it. And they can pool the money, you know, and you know, invest in a project or you know, do a development themselves with enough money. So we think the money will be used. It won't necessarily be used right away, and it might not be used. It may not be used one for one. That's true, yes. And it may not be used, you know, in the same area. It might be used somewhere else. But overall, we think it will provide affordable housing somewhere. So.
I just wanted to respond to Ms. Keller's question about setbacks. In this case, I feel like the perfect may be the enemy of the good, because you know we've been struggling with this since 2005, and we finally achieved what we think of as a compromise and a balanced approach. It can always be changed later. If somebody feels very strongly that setbacks need to be included, then someone down the road can propose that. But right now, we have something that actually the planning board and many members of the public feel is a good compromise and will, we hope, produce more affordable units. And in many people's opinion, including mine, I think it's a better approach than we've had in the past. So I would encourage you to support this because it's moving towards providing more affordable units for the town.
Can I say I second that I got caught in a detail, and that I support what you're trying to do and the work you put into it, and that it's a joint effort with the petitioner and the planning board and the planning department.
This is just a clarification question to try to untangle these things. It's sounding like from what you guys were saying earlier that the same building could be built downtown with a special permit for slight size increase right now with no setback and no, it wouldn't necessarily trigger this affordable housing. And so the difference is not less setback, the difference is just the same building would now have more affordable housing. Is that right?
Okay. Is there any other questions on inclusionary zoning? Okay. So we have one more article. Are you going to talk about it, or you want me to talk about that?
You can say what you'd like, and I'll say what I like.
Okay.
I have a little bit of time.
So there's one more zoning article on the warrant. This is a petition article to rezone certain kinds of parcels that well, the intent of the article is to cause parcels in the RO zone that are above 425 feet and not served by town water or town sewer to have to conform to the dimensional table for the RLD zone. It wouldn't change the zoning map, they would still be in the RO zone. They would just have, if they weren't on water and sewer, they would have to follow other kinds of dimensional regulations. If some point in the future they were attached to sewer, town sewer and water, they could go back to the RO dimensions. All of the parcels affected would be in the northeast section of town, in the Flat Hills Road, Market Hill Road area. And the intent of the article is to protect the town's, people who live in that area's water, to avoid the expense of extending the water and sewer lines, and to respond to the master plan's general goal of directing development away from outlying areas and towards center areas. So that's what this article is attempting to accomplish. And I will say the planning board is I think sympathetic to the aims of the article, but we are not able to support it at this time. We just have it. We think it needs a little more study, and probably needs to be considered in the larger context of development and zoning in the Cushman Village area. And so we'd like to work on it a little bit more before recommending it.
Thank you for that presentation. It seemed very fair-minded. I'm sorry not to have larger maps, but every town meeting member will get a handout in their next packet, which is, I made 300 copies today. Unfortunately, it was a color copy, so it's quite expensive. So the map is not very good, but at town meeting you'll see a larger map on the screen. But the areas of town that are above 425 feet are shown here. Thank you. In the northeast corner, as was spoken about, there is also land, of course, near the Holyoke Range that's above 425 feet, but that's not relevant to this article because that is not RO zoned. It's already RLD or protected land in the Holyoke Range, so no concern there. This article specifically deals with this strange situation in the northeast corner of Amherst, near Leverett and Shutesbury, where we are, where I live, and we are above 425 feet, which is the highest our current water tower can supply water to. So the concern, it feels like an imminent problem to my neighbors and I, which is why I brought it about this way. And I know there's it's been recommended to do a longer planning process. However, 10 years ago, I went to many meetings about our master plan, and we aired lots of opinions, and they were all documented and put together in a document which was adopted by the planning board 8 years ago. And this is one issue that has not been dealt with. A lot of downtown issues have been dealt with or are being dealt with, and yet nothing in my at least I'm aware, has happened to try to preserve the character of our outlying areas and viewscapes. So this is a large issue for my neighbors, not just because of water and sewer, which is very important, but because of the particular area where the cost would be huge, because we need a new water tower or a system of pumping stations. And it's a very expensive proposition. I have some figures of other communities that have had to do this kind of thing. And the other very interesting thing to me is that there's no data, or very inadequate data, in the town about wells. There's quite a bit of information about septic systems because people have to apply for a permit if their septic system fails to get a new septic system under Title V. And so, for instance, up at High Point Drive area, there are 27% of those houses have had failed septic systems. On Market Hill Road area, it's 29%. That's one of the factors that the DPW considers when determining whether to sewer a new area of town. There are 6 or 8 areas of town that are not served by town water and sewer, but our area is particularly expensive to do that. And the well issues are just very unknown. There was a hydrologist hired in relation to a development nearby, which is related to the impetus to get this done now. And the hydrologist's report references well data, but I have examined that well data and done some of my own research. And when we have a problem with our wells, we don't call the health department. This is sort of our own problem. So it turns out there are more problems than we realize. Thank you. I'll try to answer any questions.
And I should say what the effect of the article would be. The dimensions, it would mostly affect how much development could take place on a given parcel. It changes the RO zone requires 30,000 square feet for a building lot and 150 feet of frontage. The RLD zone requires 80,000 square feet and 200 feet of frontage. So basically, if you have a 2-acre parcel Under RO, you could put 5 lots on it, under RLD, you could put 2 lots on it. That's what the difference is.
Lisa Berry, Precinct 2. I think I understand that underlying issue here is development in your backyard, and I know it's a very pretty area. Wondering though if there's ever been, if it could ever been stated to the developer that it was mandatory that the developer then paid for a pump if there was to be development requiring increased water in this area.
I think I can answer. Many of you will remember the retreat years ago, and that was a requirement of that large development, was that they were going to provide water, which Guilford Mooring, superintendent, was very happy about, because it would mean the town wouldn't have to cover the cost getting water up to Flat Hills Road. So that was a part of that developer's requirement, but I think most small developments, it would be very expensive.
So there's 2 kinds of potential development in that area. One is subdivision development, which was what the retreat was. A subdivision is requires a process, and a subdivision requires water and sewer. You can't do a subdivision with septic. But another kind of development pattern is a by right development pattern along a street frontage. If you already have a street, you can put houses on it. A subdivision means you're building a new street and putting houses on it. So if the street already exists, you can develop along it, and that is not going to require you to put in a pump or whatever.
This is a question I faced up in Maine as well, where we're all on wells, and as more and more houses are built in what was rural area, our wells fail, and there's no other option. So if there is a situation where wells have failed, and the hydrologists have been consulted on this, and we're not going to water and sewer this in the foreseeable future, what is it that the planning board would need to consider that we don't already know now in order to vote in support of this article?
So I don't think wells have failed there. I think there's one well that is 25 feet deep. It's a dug well that had a lot of problems a couple of years ago when there was a drought. The other wells that are dug deep, 100 feet, 200 feet, we don't have any evidence that those have failed. I've read the hydrologists' reports, and I haven't seen any evidence that the wells have failed in that area, except for that one that is not a deep well.
This is just an example of how little is known about these issues. Eva, I'm sorry I don't know her last name, but it's at 493 Flat Hills Road. I met her walking a few days ago just to confirm her situation. So when she bought her house, or built her house, I'm not sure if she built it or bought it, I'm not sure, but years ago, her well was barely supplying water and it failed, so she drilled a second well. It's 650 feet deep. She gets a ½ gallon per minute, which is extremely low. They like to see at least 5 gallons a minute. So she's able to survive because it's 650 feet down, she has a lot of storage, and she doesn't have a family at home right now. So she's an example of where a well did fail, was redrilled. There's another, Teresa Pratt's neighbor redrilled their well when a neighbor built a house across the street at the top of Flat Hills, the beginning of Flat Hills Road. So there's another well that failed. But we just don't know these things because they're not reported. So I have 5 other wells I could tell you about, but I won't bore you tonight.
It's not, I think it's not boring.
Well, yeah, I mean it to mean it, but it's late, so I just, at town meeting, I might, if asked, I'll.
Yes. Yeah, just one quick question. How much of an area are we talking about, and is it smack on the northeast border? Is it No. Okay. Yeah, if you could just give me an idea.
Sure, it's not,
where we're talking about.
It's most of the northeast corner, but it's not smack. It's the Market Hill Road, Five Hills Road, High Point Drive area, and then part that's on the north side of East Levitt Road or Levitt Road?
The Henry Street is all ledge too, the landmark.
East Levitt Road.
Not Renton.
So some of that land is below 425, but not.
How many acres are we talking?
We don't know. We really haven't gotten a sense of what all the parcels that are included. I understand there's something around 150 parcels. Mr. Kaner has done some research to come up with a list of parcels, but we don't have that list, and we don't know what the acreage is. The parcels vary in size. Some of them are relatively small, and some of them are quite large, so we don't really have that information.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I have one question. Chris, because I just can't seem to get an answer to this. With the new wording of my article that's suggested by the planning department, not the planning board, not that they endorse it, but they, I thought part of the reason for that was to limit how many little lots would be affected because the RO zoning remains the same, no?
The way the article, or the way the motion is currently written is that all parcels, big or small, that are not connected to sewer or water, if they're in the RO zoning district, would need to use the larger dimensional requirements for RLD. So if the lot is 30,000 square feet now, and it's not connected to sewer or water, it would become non-conforming because it wouldn't be 80,000 square feet and it wouldn't have the appropriate frontage. So all those lots that are around High Point Drive and that neighborhood would become non-conforming because they're not 2 acres in size. So it applies to all of the lots, not just big ones.
You sort of answered my question. I was just curious how much potential development can come out of this area.
Yeah, that's what I was trying.
Landmark.
So if you look at the GIS map online, I think most of you are familiar with that. You can go up to that corner of the town and you can look at the area around High Point Drive and see what kind of density is possible. You can also look at Orchard Valley and see what kind of density is possible. But the historic development in that area has not followed the pattern of High Point Drive. That was built quite a long time ago, I think in the 60s or early 70s. And there really hasn't been that type of development there. There hasn't been that rush to develop that area with that type of size of lot in the last, what, 50 years.
Is there anybody else?
It is my understanding that the vacant land would be affected. Am I incorrect on that? And you're thinking, you mean if houses already exist and people wanted to take them down, then they would come under the same?
So if houses already exist on 30,000 square feet lots, those houses and lots would become non-conforming as a result of this measure if they're not connected to sewer and water. So when those people wanted to add a deck or maybe not a deck, but another room to their house or some expansion of their house, they would need to go and get a special permit from the Zoning Board of Appeals to expand a non-conforming building, because that would be non-conforming at that point. So it doesn't just apply to vacant lots, it applies to all lots in that zoning district that aren't connected to sewer and water.
That is correct as the article is now written, but if the motion is made, my understanding there was going to be a motion different, that would be different. That would only apply to vacant land.
If the motion is made the way it was presented to me, it would apply to all land in that area, whether it's vacant or built on.
Just, Chris, you have a list, I presented a list of all the properties affected. There was 195 entries, but when you subtract the town property and the owners that are listed multiple times because they own many lots, it's about 150 people. So I'm going door to door currently. I've got my ruler out to measure what's more than 300 feet, because the people that especially affected are those that have more than 300 feet of frontage, as I do. I will not be able to build a building lot and divide my property in half if this passes. So that's an unintended consequence to cause a hardship for people, but I feel that there's a larger community issue which relates both to the money this town wants to spend or has to spend, and also relating to the character of our outlying areas. Shutesbury requires 300 feet frontage. This would be kind of a transition in towards Cushman, where as soon as you get below 425 feet, you have RO zoning. So you'd have 200 foot frontage, then 150, then neighborhood frontage, which is much less. So I think there's some sensibleness in terms of the master plan intent.
Are there any more questions?
So we're done, I guess, right? Yeah. Tommy?
Thank you very much.